That brings us to the end of our program today. A very big thank you to That brings us to the end of our program today. Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clements, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us today as we talk about food security. Food prices are continuing to surge as pandemic-battered supply chains struggle to keep up with consumer demand. Inflation is at its highest level in 40 years, and extreme weather events and labor issues are compounding this serious problem, especially for low-income families and communities of color. As we enter the third year of COVID, how can issues surrounding access and affordability, food insecurity, nutrition, and sustainability be addressed? We have a strong lineup of speakers, and we're going to be hearing from them this afternoon. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events. Use the hashtag, that's what matters most, hashtag The Hill Food. I think that's the first time for us, The Hill Food. We're broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. And as with any live stream, you could experience occasional trouble with the video. Don't throw your computer out the window. Just refresh the page and that should fix the problem. The pandemic catapulted issues of inequality in the food system to the top of the agenda for some lawmakers. For Congressman Jim McGovern, co-chair of the House Hunger Caucus, food security has been a top priority for decades. These days, he's wearing his message on his mask. If you walk the halls of the Capitol Hill, you will recognize Congressman McGovern easily because his mask is emblazoned with the words, "End Hunger Now." Thank you for joining me, Congressman Jim McGovern. Great to be with you, Jim. Good to see you again, sir.
Yeah, it's good to be with you.
You know, look, I mean, I want to just go to something because I don't often think that White House summits fix everything, but they certainly create a punctuation point around the seriousness, and there's a kind of power in convening. And I know, and I just want to put this on the table because I found it very interesting, that, you know, our last big White House summit on hunger and food was in 1969. And I know you're advocating for another one. Are you being heard? And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, you're right. It's been a long time since we last had a White House conference on the topic. But that conference actually produced some results 53 years ago. I mean, it produced a stronger food stamp program. It produced WIC. It raised awareness about the importance of nutrition in combating hunger. So a lot of good things came out of that. And I want another one because I think it's time to convene, you know, everybody who has a role to play in combating hunger and nutrition insecurity as well. And let's come up with a comprehensive plan. We do not have a plan to end hunger in this country. And I tried under the Obama administration to move it, and we weren't able to get it off the ground. We're now trying again with President Biden, and we're having some very constructive conversations with the White House. And I'm hoping, and I'm very optimistic that they will get to yes, and we will have this conference.
Congressman, I interviewed Rashad Robinson yesterday of Color of Change, and he had this great comment. It made me think all night about it. He said, we can't depend on philanthropy to solve big structural problems. And I know there's a lot of philanthropy. In fact, you know, later I'll tell the folks, you know, I interviewed Jackie Walorski, Congresswoman Walorski, who worked with you a lot on hunger, and a lot of the approach is philanthropy. But I'll ask you the same thing, you know, go to Rashad's comment for a minute. Do we need something bigger than philanthropy to address food insecurity in this country?
We do. I mean, philanthropy is important, and we applaud all those who are, you know, donating and on the front lines and trying to help alleviate this problem. But, you know, charities will be the first ones to tell you that they're not the solution here. We need structural change. We need a safety net that doesn't have so many holes in it. You know, up until recently, the average SNAP benefit was about $1.40 per person per meal. The Biden administration has increased that slightly, but it is still, you know, wholly inadequate for a family to be able to put nutritious food on the table. And especially with inflation, I mean, food prices have gone up. It's even more difficult. We need to understand the relationship between our school systems and making sure that our kids have access to nutritious food. My two sisters are school teachers in the Worcester Public School System. They remind me all the time that meal that a child gets in school is every bit as important to that child's ability to learn as a textbook or a laptop. Our healthcare systems are like disconnected from food and nutrition. You know, why should a doctor be able to write you out a prescription for a high-priced, you know, pharmaceutical, but he or she can't write out a prescription, you know, for fresh produce, if that is what will help you get better? So we need some structural changes. We need to look at this from a different lens than we did 53 years ago. And we have to also put behind us some of these some of these notions that are incorrect. I mean, you listen to Congress debate on some of our food safety and our food security programs, you would get the impression that this is all this is about is somebody getting a job. Well, getting a job is important to solving food insecurity, but the majority of people on SNAP right now who can work actually do work. So oftentimes the narrative you hear in Congress does not reflect the reality that exists out throughout the country. And that's why we want this conference, and we want to have people with lived experiences be at the forefront, because, it's not enough for politicians to talk about hunger. We need to listen to people who actually are hungry and give us some advice on how best to solve this problem from their perspective.
Jim, it seemed like a year ago, I used to discuss food insecurity, what was going on during COVID, the breakdown of the supply chain in food inside America. Jose Andres was coming in and sharing with us what was going on in some of the private sector, responses to the collapse, dealing with, kids that were now at home and not in schools, and, how do you get SNAP credits out to folks more efficiently. I was talking to Jackie Walorski about the pork issues of, millions and millions and millions of pigs being slaughtered and not going to potential food need. I guess, with the exception of today and today's forum, I haven't heard that kind of conversation very much lately. As the pressure seems to be coming off from COVID, as we've got other things on the agenda, are we losing the moment because of the pressure created by that?
Well, I hope not, because quite frankly, this issue that we're talking about was a problem before COVID.
Right.
It just got exacerbated during the COVID crisis. I mean, before COVID, there was close to 40 million Americans who didn't know where the next meal was going to come from. That's a big problem, and it wasn't being addressed holistically. And one of the challenges to addressing it is the fact that the way Congress is set up, the way our executive branch is set up, there are bits and pieces of this issue that fall under the jurisdiction of various committees and agencies. So if you want to talk about SNAP, we can talk about the Agriculture Committee. But if you want to talk about school meals, that's the Education and Labor Committee. We have a lot of active duty servicemen and women who quite frankly are dealing with issues of hunger and nutrition and security. Well, that's an Armed Services Committee. That's a Pentagon issue. We have veterans who are hungry. Well, that's a VA and a Veterans Committee issue. So again, the reason why we want this conference is to pull everybody together, all hands on deck. Everybody has a role to play in this. By the way, not just USDA, not just HHS, not just the committees I mentioned, but transportation has a role. Getting food to people who live in rural areas, not near supermarkets. Our energy department has a role to play. The high cost of energy cuts into people's food budgets. So we need a more holistic approach, and we have to be focused on how do you end this problem, not how do you manage this problem. And so I think this is a moment where if we can get the White House to say yes, which I hope they will, we can bring everybody together. All of government, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, faith-based sector, our schools, our hospitals, you name it, get everybody together and let us come up with a holistic plan, a roadmap that we can actually, with benchmarks that we can actually follow and measure whether we're making success.
Now, I know you've got your hand in a lot of legislative initiatives, but with regard to the Hunger Caucus, are there any specific legislative drivers of this that you'd like to share with us?
Well, let me just say this. I chair the Rules Committee.
Right.
I'm also on the Agriculture Committee. One of the things the Rules Committee has been doing, by the way, because we have no jurisdictional constraints like other committees, so we can do whatever the hell we want to do. So we have been actually doing
no
hearings
rules on us.
Yeah, right. We've been doing a series of hearings on a whole range of issues, looking at this more holistically. Now, I mentioned the issue of a lot of active duty servicemen and women who are experiencing hunger. What we found out is that people's housing allowance gets counted against their overall income when you're in the military, and oftentimes spouses can't find a job because they're only deployed in a particular area for a short period of time. So these people are ineligible for SNAP or other government benefits. So, one of the things we're trying to do is get that fixed. to not have the housing allowance count against what veterans, what a service member's overall income is. We're trying to increase the reimbursement for school meals so that our kids have more nutritious food, but also so that schools can be innovative and provide additional meals and even meals for children to bring home on weekends. As I said, my two sisters are school teachers. They tell me that Mondays are the worst day of the week because kids often show up at school not having eaten over the weekend. So we need to make sure they have their nutrition over the weekend. We need to figure out better ways to get people who live in areas, again, outside of major cities or outside of out of range from supermarkets. How do we get food out to those people? We're working with companies like DoorDash and others trying to figure out innovative ways to make it easier to deliver food to people who are outside access to a supermarket. Medically tailored meals is the other thing. We all talk about the rising cost of healthcare. How do we get our medical systems, our hospitals, to be more attentive to nutrition? In medically tailored meals is one of the ways to help people get better once they get out of hospitals and to help reduce readmittance levels. So we have an endless list of things that we are working on, but we all want it to make sense. We want it to be part of one big package, and I think that's where this White House conference comes in. We need to look at this, not just it's the farm bill, so let's talk about SNAP, or it's the child nutrition reauthorization bill, so let's only talk about school meals. We need to talk about this more holistically because and everybody has a role to play.
I'd love to cover that White House conference. Jim, there's another issue, you'll kind of look at Build Back Better, and these are my views, these are my editorial views, and they don't need to be anybody else's, but I sort of look at it as like a big conglomerate that's most likely going to have to go through some disaggregation and Senator Joe Manchin has said that the pieces that are most important are going to have to go through regular order. You're in these committees. Is there any movement yet to take the pieces that relate to food security, hunger, whatnot, that were part of Build Back Better and begin moving them now by regular order? Is that a silly question?
Yeah, well, the problem we have is the filibuster in the Senate.
Right.
And again, as I said, some of the challenges we have are the perceptions that some of my colleagues have about people who are struggling with hunger. Oftentimes we hear politicians blame those people who are hungry, saying that it's your own fault. And some of the solutions here are going to be to expand some programs. But look, here's the deal. When we passed the Rescue Act, we had the child tax credit was part of it. That reduced poverty amongst children by, I think, 24%, if I'm not mistaken. And yet that has stopped. And we're still trying to work out what we can get done with Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema on Build Back Better. But again, reducing poverty by 24% amongst children is a good thing. We should all want that because, with poverty comes other challenges that these kids have to face, including hunger and nutrition insecurity. So we need to, again, figure out what, in fact, we can get through the Senate through a reconciliation process, and that requires Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema cooperating. I'm all open to passing whatever we can, so long as we can get it through the Senate. I'm not interested in exercises of moving legislation through the House that that only to die in the Senate. I want to get some stuff done. I want to help people, and that's what we're focused on.
Congressman, we're taking some questions from the audience, and we have one here for you from Craig Smith. Craig?
Hello. Craig Smith, USDA NRCS agronomist. Question: what is the anticipated role of urban agriculture in food security?
Thank you.
I think I envision a major role for urban agriculture. And I'm talking to you from my home city of Worcester, Massachusetts right now. And we're trying to take some of the rescue money that we received, and actually putting it into efforts to help promote urban agriculture in the city. We have a very diverse immigrant population, and urban agriculture has been a way for them to be able to produce, the kinds of produce that, quite frankly, that is culturally appropriate for many of these different immigrant groups. We're also trying to figure out ways to help our schools get more involved in, agriculture, on their grounds. And, Massachusetts, unfortunately, we have harsh winters. So, we're now also trying to figure out how we can do greenhouses. And we're talking about freight farms as well in our urban areas to provide food for our schools and for, people who live in economically challenged neighborhoods. So I think urban agriculture has a great future, and we need to be very aggressive about it. So again, if we get this White House conference, I'm hoping that a big piece of this will be on urban agriculture.
Just finally, as I mentioned, I talked to Representative Walorski, who does not pull her punches when it comes to being a conservative, but she really respects and admires you, and you're, I'll be admit on a little bit more on the liberal side of the equation, and I don't know if the two of you are like your old boss, Senator McGovern and Bob Dole, who also were very committed to addressing the hunger crisis in America. But it raises this interesting question about opportunities to genuinely work across the aisle in ways that get traction, that aren't silly and puffery, and whether or not what you and Jackie Walorski are doing is something that could go viral among some of your other colleagues.
I hope so. Look, I have a great deal of respect for Jackie Walorski. I've also been working with my fellow Rules Committee colleague, Tom Cole, a Republican from Oklahoma, who has been very supportive of this initiative. Others on the Rules Committee, Guy Rushenthaler, has been working with me on helping deal with the issue of hunger amongst our active duty service members. So, look, again, I think what is important here is for us to be able to strip away all the politics and actually listen to people with lived experiences, and figure out ways that we can come together, to help alleviate some of the challenges that they face. Look, we live in the richest country in the history of the world. As we speak, we got about 40 million Americans who don't know where the next meal is going to come from. I mean, I've seen hungry children in the United States, in schools, in my district. It breaks your heart. It doesn't have to be. Jackie has seen the same thing. Tom has seen the same thing. And, you mentioned George McGovern and Bob Dole. McGovern was a liberal, and Dole was a conservative. And they came together on this because they thought it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do morally. And they also thought that it was a good investment in our country. As I said, hungry children don't learn. People who go to work who are food insecure are less productive. Our healthcare system gets saddled with all kinds of additional healthcare challenges when people do not have access to good nutrition. And so, we've learned a lot since the last conference, and there are lots of good ideas out there. I've been doing field hearings all around the country. I've seen incredible models that can be replicated all across this country. Let's get this conference together. Let's do something meaningful. Let's go as big and bold as we can, and let's end hunger once and for all in this country.
I hope you succeed with that. I really would like to cover that and see that happen. Well, Congressman Jim McGovern from Massachusetts, Worcester, Massachusetts, Chair of the House Rules Committee, Co-Chair of the House Hunger Caucus. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. I always learn from you, and thank you so much for your friendship. Take care, Jim. Thank you.
Bye.
Inflation is at a 40-year high, and food prices are skyrocketing at a time when 1 in 7 Americans are enrolled in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, known as SNAP. I've got a terrific panel of experts joining me now to talk about food insecurity and the toll it's taking on vulnerable populations. Radha Mutaya is the president and CEO of the Capital Area Food Bank right here in town, which partners with 450 nonprofit organizations in the D.C. area to provide food to those in need. Lauren Bauer is a fellow of the Economic Studies Studies program at the Brookings Institution. We love Brookings, always come out to talk to us, so thank you. She conducts research on issues of economic and public concern, including the Federal Nutrition Assistance Program we just talked about called SNAP. And Jamila Michener is the co-director of the Center for Health Equity at Cornell University. Her research focuses on poverty, racial inequality, and public policy. Thank you all so much for joining us. Jamila, let me just start with the academic. I mean, I know that you can probably find academics at Brookings, et cetera, but start with your work and ask you to go back to what Jim McGovern was talking about and what I learned from Rashad Robinson in Color of Change. We can't depend on philanthropy to solve big, deep structural problems in society. So I would ask you, what does our audience need to understand by way of getting it, what I would consider to be a tectonic shift in the way we approach food security and beginning to fixing something? Because when you go back and you're talking about George McGovern and Bob Dole decades ago, a conference in 1969, this seems like a kind of bleeding ulcer we've learned to tolerate. And I would love to know from you how we approach it and really fix it.
Yeah, I think this idea of some real structural transformations having to happen can be a surprise to people, honestly. And so that's the first place really to shift our thinking around these issues. It's really interesting. I teach a class on poverty, and often when I start to go over with students sort of the state of affairs, how many people in what is a very rich and wealthy and well-off country are struggling to meet needs as basic as finding nutrition that's adequate for themselves and their families, there's always a bit of, but if you look hard enough, can't you find something to eat? Like, this is America. Aren't there food banks? Aren't there pantries? Aren't there options? Aren't there government programs like supplemental nutrition assistance and school lunch programs, et cetera? And of course, the answer to all of those things is yes, but the answer is also that each of them is inadequate. And even when we put them all together as a hodgepodge, the whole doesn't meet the needs that people have. And so I think that we need to really re-envision what it means to consider something like nutrition a basic right that everyone should have, and how should that be reflected in our public policy. Philanthropy is great, but it is out of the control of public policy. It's difficult to evaluate, and it's difficult to make sure that gaps and holes are being plugged when you're overly reliant on that mechanism. We have government programs that are supposed to be doing this, but I've been for the last few months doing interviews with people who rely on SNAP benefits about their actual experiences with those programs. And it's amazing how many people I talk to who have supplemental nutrition assistance and who are still hungry and whose families are still hungry. And so the first thing I think is recognizing this is a real problem and the current approaches are not working, shifting our thinking around food and nutrition being something that everyone deserves, no matter what their life station or situation looks like, and recognizing we can't get to other big goals. Like, we want people to be healthy. You can't have health without nutrition. We want people to be financially stable and work good jobs. You can't do that if you're not adequately nourished and able to have your basic needs met. Every other good thing we want in society requires having people have their basic needs, subsistence needs around things like food met. And coming to a consensus around those core principles is a big first step, and recognizing that the next step is going to require across-the-board change and transformation, and not simply tweaking little things, a little bit more for this program, a little bit more for that, but really rethinking the entire enterprise of meeting these needs.
Thank you for that. Lauren, listening to this, and I know this is an unfair question, but you're Brookings and you know everything there, right? So, and Jamila just, helped lay out some really nice scaffolding on this. Are there any, I sort of am motivated sometimes when I read, here are the, 10 best inclusive cities in the country, here are the 10 worst. Are there 10 great stories out there in terms of addressing food insecurity at other levels than the federal level that we can celebrate and say, hey, here's a community that's beginning to tilt the right direction, get some of the things that are right? Should we be talking about those? Or is there nowhere yet?
So I'm not really well qualified to answer that question. But I think there are some things that are important about how federal nutrition assistance works in local communities that are notable. You led a lot with inflation and how much food costs, and food costs different dollars in different
let's
places.
just stop there for a second. Steak up 17%, peanut butter 15.5%, chicken 10%, food 7%. Those are the things I care about, but I'm sure that there are many other staples. I just got these numbers for you guys today. I'm a Jif addict, so it's one of these things where you kind of look at how prices have changed so dramatically. If you're wealthy, you're fine. If you're not, you're really put up against the wall. So I didn't mean to intervene, but I wanted to kind of make it real in terms of the dramatic
No, that's right.
rises.
I think this is all about purchasing power.
Yeah.
And what the federal government has done over the past 2 years in response to the recession, specifically with nutrition assistance, but other things like unemployment insurance and the child tax credit, all of which have been putting downward pressure on food insecurity and providing resources to purchase food. And the question that we're addressing here is, how much worse would it have been without federal response? Answer, a lot worse. And how much more do we need to do as a society, not just through public policy, but through all of the stakeholders that Chair McGovern brought up that would be participating in a White House conference to bring hunger to zero in this country. One of the most important things that has happened over the past year has been an increase of 21% of the maximum SNAP benefit level that incorporates for the first time, actual purchasing power changes that are different from what it was in the 60s. And so in this moment, SNAP is a more effective program in terms of purchasing power to combat rising food prices than it has been in the entire history of the program. And so there are certainly issues, and I associate myself with, administrative barriers and it not being enough. But there's been some real positive movement in these programs over the past couple of years, bipartisan movement to address real problems like the closing of schools and the lack of access to prepared meals by creating new programs that have put out tens of billions of dollars for children to feed them. And so I think all of that is what is on the table when we talk about food prices, but also the federal policy response to the pandemic.
Thank you. Rod, I just can't imagine. I saved you, not for last year, this is the kind of conversation go around the table, but I can't imagine what it is like to be you these last 2 years. When I look at the scale of need, and my notes here say that you reach 600,000 people within the capital area, which is a staggering number. If you know the population, it's a very, very big percentage of our local population, work with more than 450 organizations. And then you get a COVID pandemic that comes on top of that I'm sure makes all sorts of interactions and levels complex. Can you just share with us a little bit about how you're achieving your goals in such a stressed out, complicated, toxic time?
Well, certainly, Steve. It's been quite the ride over the last couple of years for our clients who are in need, who are hungry and food insecure, and certainly for organizations like ours across the country who have been trying to increase the amount of food that we provide and constantly changing our operating models given supply chain challenges and the rest. So you're right. At the height of the pandemic, a 50% increase in need in the greater Washington area. And so something Chair McGovern said earlier, inequities have existed prior to the pandemic. They were huge. They've just been exacerbated even more during the course of this pandemic. Now, the 50% increase is already a staggering number, but let me say that more than 80% of the newly food insecure continued to be minorities, African Americans, Hispanic. And so this is sort of a double punch, if you will, in terms of not just elevated levels of need, but impacting those who have already been impacted by disparities and inequities before. The other thing that we're seeing now is the inflation. We've been talking about this quite a bit. And so when you've got the, increases in food prices, and for that matter, prices of other items, you mentioned some of the statistics earlier, 10 to 30% increases. The food line item is the first line item in a family's budget that gets cut when the situation gets tight. You can't cut what you pay in rent, you can't cut back your travel expenses, and you can't cut back medical expenses. So food is the line item that ends up being cut. And so you end up seeing people eat less or eat less nutrient-rich foods that tend to be more expensive. And so that has the ripple effect of health consequences as well. What we're seeing as a food bank is therefore more people come to us in asking for more produce, asking for more protein, frozen protein, any type of meat, fish, etc. Those are the items that are more expensive. And so we are having to purchase a lot more of those items because that's what's in demand. And we're very focused, as are so many food banks across the country, in ensuring that there is an adequate diet and nutritional intake of our clients. So having the right proportion of fruits, vegetables, proteins, dairy, etc., is important. And so for us now, it means just purchasing tens of hundreds of truckloads worth of produce and protein to meet the need that we're seeing in the community.
You know, after this, and I've mentioned already, I have a discussion I've already had with Congresswoman Jackie Walorski, who is a Republican from Indiana, but she makes the point that there are lots of regulations in place that inhibit the movement of food. I guess it basically contributes to food waste, that there are restaurants, there are food producers, there are farms that can't easily move food to programs like yours and to the big network that you have. What is your view on that, Radha? Do we need to kind of begin looking at how we create greater fungibility, if you will, in food assets so they can move? Would that be helpful?
Absolutely. So we need to think about the food system as a whole and not just, one part of that extended food supply chain. And we saw this work well, actually, during the pandemic. In the beginning, it was challenging, but, once the first few months were over, we saw that we could actually get all the great yield from farms across our country and have those transported to food banks across the country to be able to support those in need. And so when we look at the system in its entirety, there are lots of ways to make that more efficient, to minimize waste, to get the right food to the right communities at the right time. So that is absolutely something that we should look at. The other thing I would bring up is USDA relaxed many regulations around various food programs during the course of the pandemic. TFAP, which is the Emergency Food Assistance Program, had many of the pre-pandemic regulations of, checking different forms of ID, filling out a questionnaire, things like that were relaxed because we had to be socially distant. We wouldn't be able to get that information. But as a result, and I think it was said earlier, perhaps by Lauren, as a result, we were able to get more food to more people in need without all of this paperwork, if I can just put it that way. And that really helped keep the food security numbers higher than what they would have been if we had to adhere to the other types of regulations. So we would advocate for the loosening of regulations that have been in place during the pandemic to continue going forward, because all it does is it allows us to get food to those who are hungry, plain and simple, right, without many barriers in between. And I think, as was mentioned earlier with SNAP, again, there were many regulations that were loosened, and we would advocate extending SNAP to include many other groups that currently don't qualify. I think Congressman McGovern talked earlier about veterans and active duty personnel whose housing costs are included and right now don't make them eligible. They're college students who are not eligible, and they should be, because there's a real crisis of food insecurity on college campuses as well. And there's not policy efforts, but a lot that the private sector can do to enable this diversity of their hiring pipelines so that we can achieve multiple goals at the same time. If they also provide benefits that are meaningful to allow people to stay and work. And in the nonprofit sector, it was mentioned earlier, but we have to look at our clients holistically. Right. We provide food, but how can we also bundle that with healthcare and education and skill development so people don't stay in a state of poverty, but get to a state of greater sustainability.
Great. Thank you for that. Real quick, Jamila, I'd be interested in, your work of looking at the hard choices that people make, that are living at poverty levels, and sometimes it's a choice between medicines, and you find, medicines, foods, other rent, as we were discussing, but it contributes essentially to America's epidemic of chronic conditions, in many ways that people are experiencing. And I guess I don't mean to be facetious, folks, but I remember there being an article on the cover of the Atlantic years ago, and it had a big old Big Mac on the front of the cover, and said, if we're going to basically deal with nutrition, we have to find a way to ally and turn snack companies and fast food companies into allies. And because, when I look at the choices, you kind of go to places that are so-called food deserts and high quality food isn't available. What is available is junk food. And so I'm interested in whether or not there's an opportunity there that we are beginning to exploit, haven't exploited, whether they've made some progress. What's the situation on that front, Jamila?
I think to the extent that that there can be partnerships, whether those partnerships are with the private sector or what have you, that allow people to have access to food that is more nutritious, like that's certainly not a bad thing. Although I would caution against relying too much on that. I mean, at the end of the day, the goal of food companies or companies that sell food stuff is to make a profit. And if they can do that and also provide people with nutritious food, fine. But if there is a conflict between health and nutrition and profit, it isn't clear, and we haven't seen good evidence that health and nutrition win out. The benefit of the government, federal, state, and local governments as an arbiter in this space and as a prime actor in this space is that they can focus solely on getting people what is actually good for them in terms of access to a wide range of foods, the ability to be able to reach those foods, whether it's via transportation or what have you, and the resources to be able to afford those foods, right? And so when we think about what Radha said, what is it that people want and need and demand? It's produce, it's protein. People are very much aware of the trade-offs between good food that's nutritious for them and their pocketbooks and the ability to stay in your home and do the other things that you need to live. But they don't have sufficient choices. Right. I think part of the role that the government can play is amplifying those choices for people so that they can do the things that are healthy and giving them resources to support healthy choices. And sometimes giving them access in ways that they don't have. And if that can happen through partnerships with the private sector, fine. But I don't think we wait for the private sector to, out of the goodness of their hearts, want to do what's best for people's health when there are industries that are billions and billions of dollars worth of profits that they're making year over year that have nothing to do with providing people with access to nutritious food on a regular and sustainable basis.
Interesting. Lauren Bauer, let me, again, I don't know if this is the right way to go about this, but in the SNAP programs, I remember having a really interesting conversation with former Republican Congressman Will Hurd of San Antonio and Joaquin Castro, who's a Democratic congressman, from sort of the same area, about SNAP. And they're both supportive of SNAP in the middle of COVID, but you got this sense of, again, this is my view, uninformed, I apologize, but kind of inefficient, kind of like not reaching some people where it was, well-meaning, and they said, we need to create greater efficiencies. We need to look at things like debit cards and find other ways to create a greater nimbleness within SNAP and get over this antiquated way in which we were approaching reaching children in need in schools. And I'm just wondering, during COVID, has the stress of COVID created any evolution in the way we think of SNAP, distribute SNAP? Do we have electronic cards and a digital approach to this or not? I'd just love to get an update on that.
Yes, there's certainly been a tremendous amount of innovation and deregulation to allow greater innovation in the SNAP program over the course of the pandemic. We've been using debit cards for years, but now many states have been allowing participants to, use, the same grocery delivery services that I use in order to get meals. And so there's been a lot of loosening of those rules to the benefit of participants. In terms of school meals, we did see a new program stood up, Pandemic EBT, which put additional resources on existing SNAP cards for families with kids and distributed new cards to children who are eligible for free or reduced price meals who don't participate in SNAP in order to purchase groceries at the grocery store. To my mind, the evidence is very clear that just giving families resources to purchase food at grocery stores enables choice. It utilizes the free market, And it provides that public support that not only reduces food insecurity in the household, but these dollars are stimulative. They put money into local economies that generate more economic activity. And a dollar in SNAP is one of the best federal dollars you can spend to slingshot a recovery.
Well, look, I really appreciate all of you sharing your thoughts with us. This is a great conversation, the kind of conversation, at least I feel like we don't have enough in policy circles. Maybe all of you are, part of that community of people very concerned, but I think it's important for those of us that aren't living this day to day to get, inroads into what's happening. Radha Matai, you must have the toughest job in Washington, the president and CEO of the Capital Area Food Bank. So blown away by what you have been doing the last 2 years. Thank you so much for joining us. Lauren Bauer, fellow of Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution and smartest person I know on SNAP now. And Jamila Mishner, the co-director at the Center for Health Equity at Cornell University. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Having us.
Congresswoman Jackie Walorski, a Republican from Indiana, I've talked a little about her already, is the co-chair of the House Hunger Caucus, and she believes food security should be a bipartisan priority. She has sponsored legislation to do away with legal roadblocks that discourage restaurants, grocers, and farmers from donating excess food to those who need it most. I spoke with Representative Walorski a short while ago. Take a listen.
Representative Walorski, thank you so much for joining us today. I think really even before COVID hit, I had been interested in the food supply chain in the country and sort of how it works when it's healthy, but how we also deal with those folks that live in food insecurity. And I know that hunger is one of your big causes. And I just, in the light of the times we're in now, we don't seem to be connecting all the dots the right way because we still have a lot of folks that live with food insecurity. What do you think are the most important priorities we need to get in place to begin affecting change, real change for people that have these challenges?
Yeah, thanks. I think that we have made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot of work to do. And I think, when you look at this issue of food insecurity, Jim McGovern and I'm a couple here. Jim and I don't agree on anything politically, but we do agree upon this one thing, and it's the issue of hunger.
I should tell our audience that Congressman Jim McGovern, real liberal guy, friend of mine, up Massachusetts, not often in Indiana, I bet, but I just wanted to add that.
We started working on this about 10 years ago and really understood that this has to be a bipartisan solution. And then and it also has to be an evidence-based bipartisan solution. It has to focus on things like casework, where, people that need help on the front line that are very vulnerable don't just need a government check with a number on it. They need human interaction, human connection. And we saw that. And we've been working on it ever since. And so, we've been able to do some great things, I think, on a bipartisan level. But I think this is even the next plateau up, so that we can actually get the attention of the country and of the president and of all the shareholders to basically say, we have solutions that we think would work. We want to try it. We want to try it at the highest degree because, we've always had food insecurity in this country. Well, now you add inflation and other factors to it, and now we are in, a real mess. But the difference is, I think now we're prepared. We're prepared to present ideas at the national level and use our local communities as examples to say, what we can do this and we're going to do it. I think sometimes it's a little difficult for people to look and say, maybe they're used to being involved in a feeding program in another country, and they just look past our own country and our own neighborhood and our own local area. Well, this is the time to really start looking inward and saying we can do this in a bipartisan way, evidence-based. We have a lot of good ideas, and I think this will give us quite the boost that we actually need to get this to the next level.
Now, I happened to be looking at Senator Joe Manchin's Twitter feed the other day, and he had this great chart that said, let me tell you what inflation is doing for people at home. So it had how the prices of peanut butter had gone up, of steaks, of gas at the pump, all sorts of staples in various ways that were part of a regular person's, regular family's, interaction with stuff they were buying. And these were huge jumps. You mentioned inflation, which I think is a real serious problem for this country. And we went from a period where they said, oh, it's going to disappear in a couple of months and be transitory. Well, that story doesn't look like it's it's too strong. So I'd just be interested as we kind of look at food insecurity. These are people who are working, who have incomes, that are buying stuff. That's another dimension that's been added on top. What do you think the Biden administration is getting wrong when it comes to approaching inflation?
Well, they're getting nothing right. Let me start by saying that. And I think it's a disaster. I actually think it's a disgrace that we have a president in this country where we came into a cataclysmic environment with COVID, and then we come into another cataclysmic environment with all of the shortages and ships sitting out in the Pacific Ocean and nobody doing anything about it. Now you look at store shelves are empty, and we haven't done anything about the huge block of insecurity. And to your point, now we just put another gigantic block of food insecurity, because now the decisions aren't just normal food insecurity programs that we all support at home. Now it's, do I put gas in my car? Do I try to find food here? What do I do with the 50% increase in propane and it's wintertime in the Midwest and I'm a senior citizen on a fixed income? So I think what is happening here is this is an urgent matter now when it comes to food, but this president has done nothing to unclog that short pile of sitting in the position in the Pacific Ocean. He's done nothing to make sure the shelves are full inside of these stores, and he's done nothing to help with energy prices at the exact same time. And you know what is happening in my district? People are afraid. It's the middle of winter. It's 9 degrees today above zero, and they have to pay for everything now and an additional $250 a month of this inflation. So we're really on tough times. I'm glad we actually have some ideas and solutions to food insecurity, because the president has not made this any easier.
You know, and you're talking about those people sitting with 9 degrees weather, and you're a lot of folks in the nation also facing, really skyrocketing energy costs. It's just not gas at the pump; it's heating oil, it's all these other things. But I wanted to also say that something I didn't know until I read about some of your legislative work was I didn't know that we had roadblocks to restaurants and grocers and farmers in food donations, which made zero sense to me. And you have to have legislation that actually opens these up. What's the deal there? I mean, I'm just like, okay, sometimes you just kind of hope that eventually common sense prevails. But what is keeping the folks with the food from donating food to the people who need it?
Bureaucracy.
And I'm sorry to laugh about it, but it's still, it's like,
but
wow.
You know what? It's big government. It's bureaucracy. It's the government trying to take all these things upon themselves and make them work, when we could be engineering right now public-private partnerships that would open the doors wide open and let that food flow. And that's what has to happen in this country right now. Yeah, it does take a move of Congress to do this. I know. I think it's insane too. But
you're in a farming district, right? So, but what's keeping those producers of food or pork or whatever? And we're hearing about how beef, how I remember during COVID, how pigs were piling up, and there was no place to put all of that produce that was being there. Can you just explain to our audience who may not understand this why they couldn't donate that food to those that need it?
Rules and regulations. And they might have been little tiny ones, and people don't think anything about it if you're not in the industry, but it does matter. So one of the things that we learned quickly was, hey, we have all this pork out here that's being destroyed by the millions of poundage, and we have food banks all over our districts specifically. Why can't we get that food over there? And why does it take, a giant leap of mankind to make this happen when we were just destroying food over here and hungry people were over here? What this bill does is just blends that together, and it just makes it easier road. It takes a lot of the goofy length of time that's in there, and then some of the goofy rules that it takes to actually get something into the hands of people. But we're doing it. And I think that's just really important to say, we're doing this. We're learning in the middle of a pandemic, in the worst economic situation we've been in 40 years, in a bipartisan way. We're learning how to do this. I mean, Jim and I have worked on it for a long time together, but here we are right now with the Food Donation Improvement Act of 2021 that I dropped. It basically is going to make this a partnership that's synonymous, just like a public-private partnership. We don't need government at every turn to make this work. A lot of this is common sense Hoosier solutions. We just need to get the government out of the way. And I think you'll see improvements much quicker and faster, because we've learned this on the run. Evidence-based programs. How difficult is that to understand? And how successful is that when you employ that tested and tried evidence-based program that uses people, case management instead of numbers and computers, and actually tying back into the human need? Really important,
Right.
very simple.
I'd love to hear this story of your district, Congresswoman Walorski, and how they are dealing with these times, in the sense that, I know Speaker Pelosi the other day said, look, inflation is a natural part of having this many people employed. When I look at the numbers, there are a lot of people, there's a huge jobs gap out there, and a lot of people haven't gotten back into those jobs and positions. What is the job situation and the job gap, in your district in Indiana? How is that reflected nationally when it comes to too few workers and too many slots in this time?
I always appreciate Pelosi's words when she's a part of this whole problem. But let me tell you something. I'm glad you asked about that. In my district, the unemployment rate is 0.9. It's the lowest unemployment rate in the country, 0.9. And let me tell you what's still happening. They have jobs, they're working, and they're getting money taken out of their left pocket and their right pocket to feed this big government machine of inflation. So places where you wouldn't even believe people are struggling, they're struggling. Today, the cost of gasoline, a gallon of gas is $3.40. A pound of hamburger is about $5 a pound, and bacon is probably $8. And I sit in the middle of the pork industry. Tell me how that makes sense. This is just the foolery that's going on with somebody at Speaker Pelosi's level, trying to tell one of the biggest working environments we have in the country, which is my district, that they must not be doing something right. They must be doing this and doing that. They are doing something right. They're taking care of their families. They're working. They're trying to stretch these dollars to make sure they can pay for everything that's being caused by an out of control Biden administration.
Just finally, Congresswoman, you've said very nice things about Congressman Jim McGovern. And, it's nice to hear of this bipartisan moment of two people across the aisle working together on this. What are some of the other dimensions of your partnership with Jim McGovern on the food and hunger challenges that we might look forward to this next year?
Well, we established this hunger caucus because we really believe that this deserves the attention from the American people on both sides of the aisle. There's probably still people all over the country that would look you and me in the eye and they'd say, we don't have a hunger problem in our district and our neighborhoods. And, I beg to differ and say you probably do, because you know what, when I realized the kind of hunger needs in my own district and the people that were doing their best and working and raising kids and still not having enough food to make it, that's when I got involved, rolled up my sleeves and said, I'm going to change this. I'm going to work with whoever will work with me. And Jim and I have done that. We established this caucus, this hunger caucus, so other members could join us. And we can collectively now start making real differences in neighborhoods and using those as a model to put out to the rest of this country. I'm really excited. I mean, I'm not running away from problems, certainly, and I'm not a runner away from problems. I'm a solution builder, and I can see light at the end of the tunnel that we are almost there in making the kind of connections we need to really impact the food insecurity and food deserts in our districts and around this country. So I'm looking forward to this year, looking forward to the fact that we're elevating this whole issue again, and we are going to have solutions that work.
Well, Congresswoman Jackie Walorski, who's a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, she's ranking member of the Subcommittee on Worker and Family Support, and she, with Jim McGovern and others, is the creator and co-chair of the House Hunger Caucus. Thank you so much for talking with us. It's important to remember that real people are out there having a tough time right now, and I'm very grateful for you sharing with us your candid views on how to approach it.
Thanks so much.
Hey everyone, Congressman Jackie Walorski has a very big British lab, and during that conversation I was hoping her pup would, jump up, but that didn't happen. But watching it again, I kept thinking, oh, maybe you'll see it. But in any case, a little silliness to go with a bunch of serious issues here. That brings us to the end of our program today. A very big thank you for you joining us today. If you missed any of the conversations, we're going to have them all up on our website shortly. Thank you for watching. I'm Steve Clemens. Be well.